One of the most difficult questions you can ask a book lover is, what is your favourite book? But that is precisely the question I am going to try to answer today as I share with you my all-time favourite classics. This is a video that I first filmed in 2019, but I recently watched that video back and was very surprised at how my answers to what are your all-time favourite classics has changed in the years since, as I have read more, as I have changed as a person. So some books have been displaced from that list. There are new additions too. I have tried my best to include all of the books that I love, that I'm just so excited to share with you, because hopefully you'll love some of these just as much as I love them too. So I have arranged this list by author rather than a set ranking, just because sometimes they change depending on what kind of a mood I'm in, but I'll talk more about why they are favourites of mine and why I think you should all read them too. So I'm not going to make you wait right to the end of the video to talk about my favourite books. Instead, I am going to jump straight to it and talk about the Brontë sisters. This, of course, is probably no surprise to you if you've ever watched any of my videos or know anything about me, because I am a huge lover of the Brontë sisters' works, of their lives, just everything about them. And my all-time favourite book is Shirley by Charlotte Brontë, which may be surprising because Jane Eyre is of course her most popular work, her most well-known work, but Shirley has been my favourite book since I was about 17 or 18, and I think it will stay that way. I want to say forever, I can't promise that, but it really is a book that means so much to me on a personal level, and it's the book that I just connected with most, even though it might not be her best written work either. Shirley was Charlotte Brontë's second published novel, her follow-up to Jane Eyre, and in it she attempts to do something different to address some of the criticisms around Jane Eyre, and she writes a historical piece set at the beginning of the 19th century when the Luddites were in Yorkshire destroying equipment that was going to bring heavy industrialisation to the area. There are various different characters in this book, such as Robert Moore, the mill owner, and there are a group of curates inspired by some of the people that Charlotte Brontë knew in her own life that add this humour to the book. But my favourite characters are Shirley Keelder, the eponymous Shirley, and Caroline Helston, who is quite possibly my favourite character ever to have been written. Shirley was, at the time this book was written and the time that the characters were living, a male name, but Shirley was born a girl, a disappointment as the heir, and so she was still named Shirley, bringing it about as a female name. But Shirley really does sort of embody this progressive, I want to say feminist, but I'm not sure if Charlotte Brontë would agree with me on that, life as a woman at the turn of the 19th century. And Caroline is slightly different again. She's an 18-year-old who is slightly naive, sort of learning about the world, and her place in it is much more shy than Shirley and more unassuming, and that's why they complement each other so well, and why seeing their development as characters with each other, alongside each other, but also as individuals is so special. At the opening of the novel, Charlotte sort of sets out her manifesto for writing this, how she wants to write a novel as unromantic as Monday Morning. But when we take romantic in the sense of when she was writing this book, she's talking about how she wants to write a work of realism, a book that is grounded in the reality of the people that were living. Sometimes that's effective, sometimes it's not quite as effective, but it's still a novel that means so much to me, and so it doesn't have the same literary merit maybe as Jane Eyre, but it's a book that I instantly connected with, and that's why it is my all-time favourite book. And then of course we have to talk about Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Even though Shirley is my favourite Brontë novel, my favourite novel, Wuthering Heights is a very close second. I read this again when I was a teenager and it meant so much to me. This is the book that people get sick of me talking about. I am its biggest fan and I am very defensive of it too, so nobody criticise Wuthering Heights in my presence because I will argue back. Wuthering Heights tells the story of two generations of the Earnshaw family who live at this remote Yorkshire farmhouse, Wuthering Heights, and the Earnshaw family take in a young foundling boy, Heathcliff, who grows up to be in love with the youngest daughter, Cathy, and their love for each other, their obsession with each other, and their jealousy in the relationships that they have with other people are what make this book a passionate tale of revenge. We have elements of the supernatural in this, an interesting narrative structure that will take your head a little while to get around, but once you're into it, it really adds to the story and how Emily tells this story. There are way too many people with the same name, so talking about it becomes very confusing, but ultimately it is a book that embraces the extremes of emotion and extremes of feeling, a depth that doesn't shy away from the best and worst of humanity. I can never get away from Wuthering Heights. It's a book that will continue to haunt me in the best way possible for the rest of my life. And then I do have to mention Anne Brontë, who was very difficult to narrow down a book to because I love both of her novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And whilst I do love The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, very much could have included it here, but that might be an entire Brontë video. I have to choose as one of my all-time favourite classics, Agnes Grey. This has such a special place in my heart, as do all of the Brontë books, but particularly this one, because this was the first Brontë book that I read, which is very out there. It's very much one of the forgotten novels that not a lot of people have read compared to the others, but I think it's so special and also is the most normal, sane romance in any of the Brontë novels. So this follows Agnes Grey, a governess who looks after two very unruly families who she definitely does not have control over. It is sort of the sister novel to Jane Eyre because they're following some of the same themes, but this doesn't have that extra gothic element that Jane Eyre has. This is very much a book grounded in realism. The main character, Agnes, is very concerned with living a moral life, about doing her best at all times, and she despairs at some of the immorality that she sees in the young people that she is caring for, the various qualities that she herself would choose not to live by. But there's also this beautiful romance between her and Mr. Weston, a village curate, and the final scenes of the book I think are so beautiful, and I can't believe they've never been adapted to film or TV because I think they would be so beautiful to play out. I really fell for them and their dynamic, which is definitely the most healthy relationship dynamic of any of the Brontë novels, in this very sweet way. It really is one of the forgotten Brontë novels, but Anne deserves all the love. She was such a skillful writer who came into her own for sure in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and I would have loved to have seen what she would have written for her third novel, because I think that would have been very special, whatever it was. Everything about this book is so lovely, and I can see why after reading this I fell head over heels in love with the Brontë sisters. After the Brontë sisters, my second favourite novelist, if we lump the Brontë sisters in with each other, I love Thomas Hardy, and I've read quite a lot of his novels now. Some I love more than others, but I have narrowed it down to two, which is a surprise to me. I'm going to talk about them in tandem because I think they are two very different novels, and if you've never read any Thomas Hardy, either of these would be a good place to start. So my favourites are Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Far from the Madding Crowd. Tess the D'Urbervilles is tragic, heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. It's the kind of book that will make you want to scream at the page, but also that you will love because it's so full of these complex, powerful themes that pervaded Victorian society and that Thomas Hardy isn't afraid to call out. This means so much to me because it's one of the books that I read after having watched the adaptation when I was 8 years old. So I loved this story right from being a tiny child who probably shouldn't have been allowed to stay up watching Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I did, and the story stayed with me so that when I read this for the first time as a teenager, it just brought back all of these very formative memories for me, and I think is one of the reasons that I'm such a big classics reader today. Tess Durbeyfield, our main character, is from a poor rural family, having to very much work hard to earn a living, to support her younger siblings, to support her parents. But right at the beginning of the novel, Tess's father hears that they are descended from the ancient noble d'Urberville family, and Tess is then sent out to the d'Urbervilles to claim kinship with them, and there she meets Alec d'Urberville, a good-for-nothing man who takes advantage of Tess, and she becomes pregnant. Of course, at this point in time, in the Victorian era, not only was it controversial, extremely immoral to get pregnant out of wedlock, it was also a very controversial thing to write about this in a novel, to have a main character who was portrayed as having a child out of wedlock, to living a life that was completely against the moral standards of the day. And this, therefore, was a book that faced a lot of censure from the reading public and critics of the time. But it's what Thomas Hardy does best. He treats Tess as a character with such beautiful empathy. He really stands by her, and in doing so caused complete moral outrage. Thomas Hardy is such a fantastic writer that I would trust this story at this time in nobody else's hands, but he manages to write a complete masterpiece, and I have so much respect for this book. But on the other hand, if you don't want a book that is quite as heartbreaking as Tess of the d'Urbervilles, isn't quite so tragic, my other favourite Thomas Hardy book is Far from the Madding Crowd. Another book full of this wonderful imagery of the Wessex landscape, Thomas Hardy's fictional county that he plays around in, and is very much talking about rural life at the early part of the Victorian period. This is about Bathsheba Everdene, who inherits a farm, and her various suitors who woo her. Because she's a landed woman, of course she needs a husband. Bathsheba is inhabiting a predominantly male world and trying to succeed, despite the fact that people don't think that she will. And at points in the book she is incredibly naive and makes the wrong decisions completely. But that's what drives the story forward, and at points adds moments of humour, and at other points you get moments that feel incredibly sad and incredibly touching too. It's a truly special read that has never left me. We're jumping forward in time now to talk about two books written by Virginia Woolf. We have Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. Mrs. Dalloway was the first Virginia Woolf book that I read, and I instantly fell in love with it. It was like nothing I had ever read before, which I think is the reason why she really is one of the greatest novelists of all time. She completely set the tone for a new era of writing, post-Victorian, post-Edwardian writing that was groundbreaking for its time. Mrs. Dalloway is a story that happens on a single day, and we follow Clarissa Dalloway as she prepares for a party. The opening line is, and it's one of the most iconic lines ever to have been written, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. So just as Mrs. Dalloway, who has been very ill and has very much been in recovery from illness, as she's preparing for this party, we also meet Septimus Warren Smith and his wife Lucretia, and he is a war veteran who is still coming to terms with his experiences during the war and his subsequent mental illness. It's told in Virginia Woolf's signature stream of consciousness style, and so we get this beautiful mix of the present, of memories, of thought, of reminiscence, but it's a book that hits incredibly hard emotionally, and it's a book I've never actually reread, but I would love to soon, because I think I would love it even more now than when I originally read it. The other Virginia Woolf favourite of mine is To the Lighthouse, which I actually read very recently, and so I think I was very conscious in selecting all of these books of recency bias, assuming that because I had read something relatively recently that I would love it more. But actually this book has grown on me since I read it. I originally started reading it, wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy it. I didn't like it that much, but I read it in full last year, and it's a book that has stayed with me and grown with me, and my thoughts towards it have developed long after I turned the last page. This follows the Ramsay family, who each year holiday on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, who have their own home, and we meet them prior to the First World War, where they have invited various people to stay with them. One of the younger sons is obsessed with going to visit the lighthouse, but there's never quite like the perfect opportunity to go out there. And whilst the first part of the book is preoccupied with introducing these characters to us, about thinking a lot about what's going on internally with them, we then pick up with them years later at various different points in their life as they return to the island, but their lives have changed because of the war, because of circumstances. Life touches them, and we see how people deal with some of the hardest, almost complex things that we deal with as human beings. The book heavily deals with grief in its most literal sense of grieving somebody who has died, but also grieving for a time that you can't return to, grieving for the person that you once were or a life that you thought that you might had, but also about the effect that grief has on the places around us, a crumbling of your life and the place that you live. I really do think this is one of the best books that has ever been written in the English language. Like, I love Mrs. Dalloway, but I think the more I think about this book, the more I think it is Virginia Woolf at her absolute best. Her reason for writing, the reason that she's so good at what she did. This book is everything that is best about Virginia Woolf. I think that's why I love it so much. And now we have a book that perhaps controversially I wasn't sure if I was going to include as a favourite, but it's a book that has stayed with me and how I view the art of storytelling, that I felt like, how could I not include it? I feel like it would be a huge oversight if I didn't mention this book, but I think it's one that I absolutely am due a reread of, and so my thoughts towards it have ebbed slightly over time, but it really is still a favourite. This is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. In Rebecca, we have a nameless narrator who marries a man called Max de Winter, and our narrator is haunted by his ex-wife. She moves in with him to his house, and everywhere there are echoes of Rebecca, who is this larger-than-life character who died under mysterious circumstances. And it's a book full of dreams and nightmares, a book of mystery that you will still be unravelling after you've finished reading it. It's a book that has questionable morals. The characters, you're not quite sure if you love them, if you hate them. It's a book full of unnecessary uncertainty, which reflects the mental state of our narrator, who is living in a home, living a life that doesn't feel like it's hers. I also love Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, which very much feels like her take on Wuthering Heights. This, I feel, is her take on Jane Eyre. They're different books, of course, but I feel like in many ways this is a book that pays tribute to Jane Eyre and couldn't have been written necessarily if Charlotte Brontë hadn't written Jane Eyre. But it's interesting to take a story like that and bring it into the 20th century and to feel haunted too by Rebecca, just as our narrator does. I have a confession to make, which is that I almost didn't include Jane Austen in this video, which feels sacrilegious to say, but the thing with Jane Austen is that she feels like such a big part of my life that her books just seem to blend into the fabric of my very being, and so trying to choose a favourite feels impossible, that I almost don't want to do it. But I've done it, because I felt like you would all have been very angry with me if I hadn't have included Jane Austen, and I feel like I would have been angry with myself. So let's try to do it, even though I'm not sure I have an obvious favourite Jane Austen novel. But the two today that I have chosen are Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. But now I'm thinking about it, maybe I want to include Northanger Abbey too. Maybe I want to talk about Emma. I know I don't want to talk about Mansfield Park, and I haven't yet read Sense and Sensibility, but I don't think that's going to be a favourite either. But how do I talk about how much I love Jane Austen within the scope of just a few books? I love her as a whole. I love her because she's one of the greatest writers of all time, because I connect with her writing. I think it's so funny, so witty. But actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure I can choose a favourite Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice was the first that I read, and so of course it holds a very special place in my heart because of that. It was also one of the first classics that I ever read, and those books really do stay with me because I feel like if I hadn't have read them, maybe I wouldn't be here today. And Pride and Prejudice is a story that I love beyond the book. I love watching adaptations of the book. I love watching modern adaptations that play on the book and do something different with it. I love hearing people talk about it. I love reading books that are inspired by it. This is a story that is just so pervasive within our culture, that has just changed, I think, the face of how we engage with the topic of romance. This is the Jane Austen book, and it feels like my Jane Austen book. But I think the reason that I've also chosen Persuasion, although if I film this again tomorrow, I feel like maybe I would choose one of the others. Persuasion is such a sweet book. It has, I think, some of these powerful romantic scenes, like when Captain Wentworth writes his beautiful love letter at the end. It has these big moments that I think some of the other books don't quite have in the same way, and so they feel like the ones I reach to first of all. So maybe what I should say is that Persuasion is probably my favourite love story. Pride and Prejudice has my favourite romance between our two characters and also feels the funniest to me. But maybe I will quickly bring in Northanger Abbey to this debate too, because Northanger Abbey has in Catherine Morland my favourite of Jane Austen's heroines. And also I love Emma for the chaos. So I've changed my mind even as I'm filming this. I love her so much that I would almost rather not talk about her, because then I have to come to some sort of decision. And as you can tell, I can't do that. But an author that I love that it was much easier to select a favourite from was Edith Wharton, and my favourite of her books is The Age of Innocence. Edith Wharton was a New York society gal who was writing about New York society around the 1870s, 1880s, a world that she knew so well, and so she's able to get into the nitty-gritty of the society drama, the society gossip, but also the issues that were inherent in people's lives at this time. Quite honestly, The Age of Innocence is a book that I can only describe as a sucker punch kind of book that will hit you right in the feelings, right where it hurts the most. This is about Countess Ellen Olenska, who has grown up in New York society but has married and gone to live in Europe. But when she flees her husband in Europe and joins New York society again, she meets Newland Archer. They fall in love, but he is already engaged to May. So there is a slight love triangle going on, but really this is a book about the restrictions of New York society and how the people who live in it are restricted by these very tight social codes that are the leading cause of their unhappiness despite their wealth, despite their social position. It is these moral codes, the censure of outcasts, anybody who doesn't quite fit into the society, that leads to tragedy within the characters' lives. Edith Wharton is one of the most beautiful writers that I have ever read. She manages to write such beautiful, complex emotions in a way that feels very accessible to a modern day reader, but also challenges your way of thinking and the way that you engage with the text. You feel so immersed in this world, as if you are on the edges of this society looking in, so absorbed and so engrossed in the goings on of society. I'm still not over it, and what Edith Wharton put me through, I will never forgive her, but I loved it too. With my whole heart, I love E.M Forster. I don't love all of his books. His books are kind of hit or miss for me. Some of them I like a lot. Others I love, and my favourite E.M Forster book is Howard's End. Another book that just feels so beautiful and has that warm feel to it, whilst also delving into the hardships of society at the turn of the 20th century. We follow in Howard's End 3 families whose lives become interconnected. We have the Wilcoxes who own Howard's End. We have the Schlegel sisters who come from this very bohemian family who are slightly more artistic and upper middle class, and we also have the Basts who are living in relative poverty compared to the other characters. It's this interplay of generation, of social class, that adds great depth to this book, and that feels so masterfully done that you don't quite realise what E.M Forster is doing until it hits you and until these big events happen that bring the characters even closer together. Another one of the reasons that I love this book so much too is I also love the Merchant Ivory adaptation, which is one of the most beautiful films I have ever watched. One of my sort of comfort watches that when I want something to turn my brain off and to be completely absorbed in, I turn to. And so again, it's a story, like many of the others I've mentioned, that stays with me long after I've finished reading the book, that takes on a life of its own outside of E.M Forster's original words. A book that I really love that I've hardly seen anyone talk about is Look Back with Love by Dodie Smith, who is best known for writing books like I Capture the Castle and 101 Dalmatians, which was my favourite Disney film when I was growing up. And Look Back with Love is the first instalment of Dodie Smith's autobiographies, and this is a nostalgic look at her growing up in the Edwardian period, growing up raised by her mother and her uncles in their family home in Manchester. And I feel this like real emotional connection with this book and with young Dodie, and she has such a lovely way of looking back at her life and selecting these moments that really stood out to her as a child. And their family was so lovely too to read about, that this is another one of my comfort reads, a book that I'll turn to reread my favourite sections and just to feel part of this age that no longer exists and that she felt so fond of. Since I read it last year, I have been head over heels obsessed with Jill by Amy Dillwyn, which absolutely is one of the most bonkers books that I have ever read in my life. This is wild from start to finish because we follow Jill, who is a privileged young woman whose father remarries and she gets an evil stepmother and she runs away from home. She leaves her social position behind to become a lady's maid, and she travels around Europe with the woman that she has fallen in love with, a woman, Kitty, that she has found incredibly beautiful since she was a child. And there are so many events in this book that you will never be able to predict. It's hilarious and also just mad all at once, and I want everybody to read it because I want more people to talk about it with. The voice of our main character Gilbertina is hilarious and I think is best summed up in this section just before she runs away. It says, "It became evident to me that her ladyship, her stepmother, destined me to play the part of Cinderella. As I had no fancy for that role, and as I had not a fairy godmother to come to my assistance, I must take the matter into my own hands and act fairy godmother for myself. Therefore I determined to execute the plan which I had already reflected upon so often, and to run away from home and take my chance of what might afterwards befall me." This is a book about embracing everything that life has to throw at you and to making the most of a terrible situation. And it's groundbreaking as a work of queer fiction that was published in the 1880s but embraces the idea of a happy ending. I'm obsessed with it. I want everybody else to be too. It wouldn't be my all-time favourite classics video without talking about Elizabeth Gaskell, another favourite Victorian author of mine. My favourite of her books, and again one of my favourite stories, is North and South. I want to return to the idea of reading a book and then watching an adaptation and loving it even more, because I think that's the mark of a good story that translates so well across mediums. I love the BBC miniseries of this book. I think it's just the most romantic thing that's ever been made. And North and South, I think, is Elizabeth Gaskell's homage to Pride and Prejudice. It's a story that very much feels like not an imitation, because I think imitation feels like it cheapens it slightly, but it very much feels like a story, a dynamic between our main characters in the same mold of Pride and Prejudice, what we would now call enemies to lovers. Our main character is Margaret Hale, who has moved from the south to an industrial town in the north of England, which is very much a culture shock. Her father is giving lessons to a local mill owner, John Thornton, who Margaret very much does not get on well with, and they really do not click straight away. But the closer they become, the more sympathy they have for each other. And I think this is interesting to have talked about when I've talked about Shirley by Charlotte Brontë earlier, because this North and South is the book that has the most sympathy for the industrial characters, for the working class characters who were working in the mills at the time. This is similar in many ways to Shirley, but Shirley doesn't have the same patience with the working class characters as Elizabeth Gaskell does in North and South. So we see slightly more of the arguments in favour of unionisation in the early days of unionisation. We see more of the hardships of the characters and how it is affecting their lives and the conditions that they were working in. It's a book that epitomises industrialisation in Victorian fiction and is a must read. And last, but most definitely not least, I would like to talk to you about The Call by Edith Wharton Zangwill. I think this actually might be in my top 5 favourite books of all time. It's a book that just feels like it was written for me. It's a book about the suffragettes, who I love reading about, but it's also a book about the First World War and about a young woman, Ursula, from a privileged background who is a scientist who becomes involved in the suffragette cause, goes on hunger strike, is very in the inner workings of the suffragette movement, but also goes about trying to find solutions to many of the issues affecting First World War soldiers in the trenches, because of course she's a suffragette and she's a pioneering scientist, and she's a woman who can do whatever she wants to do, whatever she sets her mind to, everything that was best about the suffragettes when the suffragettes were at their best. Edith herself and her stepmother, Hertha Wharton, were suffragettes, so there was nobody better equipped to talk about what it was like to be a suffragette and to be part of this movement that was changing protest as we know it. It is a book that you will enjoy reading, that you will get so much out of and learn so much about too. It's a book that is just full of, I don't want to say joy, because it's a book about the suffragettes and the First World War, but it's a book that has such a lively voice that carries you through the entire novel, and it's a book that you want to spend time with and that you'll be upset when it finishes. So those were my all-time favourite classics. I'm so excited to film this video again in another few years and see how this list has changed, just as I felt when I watched my 2019, my original video back, and felt like I had changed so much as a person since and had read so much since. That is, I think, the joy of reading classics, going on this journey with them, and that journey changes depending on what you're experiencing in your own life and the other books that you've read too. I think the more you read, the more experience you have reading classics, the more you have to draw on, and that makes that experience so much more rewarding. I would love to know in the comments your all-time favourite classics. Make me a list. Do a top 10, do a top 5, but I do want to know what are your all-time favourite classics. Thank you so much for watching this video, and who knows, maybe I'll see you in another few years for an updated all-time favourite classics list. Happy reading!